On this slide, the red arrow indicates where a distinct pathway is beginning to form as a thought or set of thoughts is repeated. It could be one dominant thought that's repeated all the time, or a combination of thoughts, a thought pattern. We call this thought pattern a perspective. So let's say this perspective is, I just don't care. And all of its little cousins. Just go ahead and eat it. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't matter anyway. I can skip lunch, or I can work this off tomorrow. Everyone else is doing it. It's a celebration. Live a little. Just go ahead and celebrate. Sound familiar? I thought they might. So if this is my perspective, then when I'm faced with a decision about what to eat and how much, I am far more likely to choose poorly or to overeat. And each time I think this way, I'm strengthening this perspective at roughly 10,000 synapses a time. The more I use this way of thinking, the stronger this pathway or perspective gets. Over time, this repeated thought pattern establishes a default perspective that practically ensures that I will continue to make poor food choices and eat too much. By the time one is an adult, in his or her 40s, one has made food choices roughly 70,000 plus times. Multiply that by the number of likely thoughts involved, times the number of individual synapses comprising those thoughts, and we're easily into the billions. This represents a very robust default circuit that supports this thinking that we no longer want. And if the firing of this circuit involves the release of dopamine, which we know that eating does, this circuit becomes quite strong. Dopamine is the chief neurotransmitter involved in the formulation of pleasure-seeking thoughts and behaviors. Dopamine is literally like fertilizer to these pathways. But before we go any further, we have to understand a critical aspect of the human brain. It has canceling properties. Just like sound waves, two thoughts that are 180 degrees out of phase cancel each other out. We cannot just decide to stop thinking the unwanted thoughts. That will never work. The human brain just simply doesn't work that way. Rather, we have to design thoughts that are exactly 180 degrees out of phase with the existing thoughts, the ones we're attempting to change, and then start thinking these new thoughts. Another term for this canceling property is mutually exclusive thoughts, or METs. Mutually exclusive means one or the other, but not both at the same time. In other words, I cannot think that it doesn't matter and that it does matter at the same time. My brain must choose one or the other. And it chooses based on signal strength. Which thought has been thought the most? That's the way it works. This aspect of the brain is really the brain's security system. It works this way to ensure that we don't accidentally delete a program that could crash the entire system. Now take notice of the colors on this slide. The yellow line represents the default thoughts, the ones we've been talking about, and the red line represents the new thoughts, the METs that we're about to construct. This slide indicates the very beginning of cognitive editing, constructing these new METs, or mutually exclusive thoughts. The lone red connection in this slide indicates an MET that we need to be thinking instead of the old default thought. Now notice that this thought is connecting to a different neuron, one that is a member of the cortex system. The cerebral cortex is where we form logic and reason and process mega amounts of information. Motor skills, language skills, auditory and visual input are all processed in the cerebral cortex system. To make the change happen, we have to fully engage the cortex system. For our purposes here, this red line will represent the thought, I do care. I care a lot. My health is very important to me. Instead of that old default thought, I just don't care. Now at this point, the new thought is just a fledgling, no match for the default pathway. So this new thought, even though it's far more logical and intellectually fits our purpose, is just no match for the default pathway. Our thoughts will still be channeled down the default pathway. That's how our brains really work. They follow what we call a path of least resistance. It's the law of physics. There's no getting around it. And this explains why I can know better, but still do it anyway. As we keep repeating the new thought, however, the new circuit begins to grow. This is achieved by actually thinking the new thought. Remember, each time we think the new thought, our brains secrete neural growth factor to stimulate new growth of this new circuit, the red circuit. This circuit literally has to be fired over and over again to gain signal strength. We can accelerate this process, but only by so much. We're still governed by math, chemistry, and physics, and the process simply cannot be short-circuited. This red circuit contains logical thought, but logic does not trump physics. At this stage, the individual knows better than to think, I don't care, and is trying desperately to think, I do care, but still finds himself obeying the I don't care circuit and eating it anyway. It's a pretty frustrating place to be, of course, but we can't circumvent this stage with just willpower or motivation. In fact, this is the neurobiological explanation for what we often call lack of willpower. Physics trumps willpower. Physics trumps motivation. Physics trumps logic. That's just the way it works. Sure, we might be able to send some of our thoughts up the red pathway some of the time with great effort, but ultimately the yellow circuit will win because the decision battle will be won by the law of physics. Now the first thing you're going to notice on this slide is a thicker red line. This thicker red line represents an amplified thought. Fortunately, we do have a way to catch up to the yellow circuit. The key is to create a greater number of synapses with each passing thought, one that is exponentially greater. And this is achieved by loading the red circuit in written language, spoken language, audio, and visual input. Verbal acquisition and visual acquisition of our new thoughts requires much greater bandwidth to process in the brain. More synapses are being fired. This is how we fully engage the cortex system. Writing down an MET thought requires at least 10 times the number of synapses than thinking it alone. Why? Because we must engage every lobe of the cerebral cortex to complete a written thought. In addition to thinking it, we must engage our language skills. This is huge. Fine and large motor skills, sensory input, and visual input. Listening to spoken language and watching video steps up that signal strength exponentially as well. Processing audio and video requires mega amounts of synaptic activity in the cerebral cortex. We can literally catch up 100 times faster or more than the speed with which the old default was built. This process is known as CAVP, Cognitive Audio Visual Programming. In the brain, it's like jumping from 3G to 4G download speed. Over time, and with repetition, the new thought can be grown to the point where it can actually rival the old. Even when we make use of a powerful technique like CAVP to increase that effort exponentially, we're still going to have to contend with a rather large number of repetitions just to catch up with the old, in this case the yellow, circuit. What can be so frustrating is at this point in the process we've practiced it dozens of times, but yet the old default circuit is still winning, and more often than not we are just going to go ahead and eat it anyway. chalk that up to physics. But lest we be too quick to curse the system, stop and think about it for a minute. You really wouldn't want it any other way. This is absolutely necessary for the stability of the system. If our brains didn't think this way, we simply wouldn't survive. It really is a pretty marvelous system. Again, it's a security system, preventing a total crash. And once we get the darn things configured properly, they are more likely to stay configured that way. In fact, at that point, we would actually have a hard time reversing that process.